The Bible had been sitting in the donation bin for weeks, buried beneath stacks of brittle hymnals and water-stained encyclopedias. Margaret Ellis, head librarian of St. Bartholomew's Archive, had handled hundreds of forgotten books in her 20 years. But something about this one made her pause. Its leather binding was darkened to the color of old coffee, the spine ridged and uneven as though it had been reinforced or tampered with. She lifted it, surprised by its weight. It was too heavy for its size, and when she tilted it, she heard the faintest rattle, like a loose bead trapped inside. Her fingers traced the ornate gold cross embossed on the cover. 15th century. Maybe earlier, she murmured. The edges were frayed, but not destroyed, the scent of dust and aged vellum rising as she opened the first page. Latin text marched in precise lines, a monk's careful hand, preserving words that had survived wars, reformations, and centuries of human carelessness. She turned a few pages, her trained eye catching something odd. On the lower inside margins of certain sheets, small marks, not quite ink stains, not quite burns. They looked almost deliberate. She frowned, bringing the book closer to the reading lamp. The marks didn't match the text's alignment. They were too irregular. When she flipped quickly through, the spots seemed to form a shifting pattern. The sound inside the spine nagged at her. She pressed along the leather with her thumb. It gave slightly, as though there was space beneath. On impulse, she fetched a thin bone folder from her desk and slid it gently into the seam between the pages and the binding. There was resistance at first, then a soft click. A narrow compartment opened along the hollowed spine, revealing a thin roll of parchment tightly bound with twine. Margaret froze. It wasn't unusual for Bibles to contain family records or pressed flowers, but this was different. The parchment was darker than the pages, the fibers rough and uneven. She set it on the table, her pulse drumming in her ears. As she carefully untied the twine, a faint scent of smoke drifted up, as if the parchment had once been held too close to fire. The rolled sheet unfurled to reveal not words, but strange geometric shapes, circles intersecting triangles, lines that bent into cryptic symbols. Some looked like stars, others like tiny runic letters. A strange heat flushed her cheeks. This was no ordinary doodle. She reached for her magnifying glass. The ink wasn't black. It had faded into a brownish hue, but when the light hit it at a certain angle, it shimmered faintly, like powdered gold. Whoever had drawn these symbols had gone to extraordinary lengths to make them both durable and discreet. Margaret's mind began to race through her training. She had seen marginalia, shorthand, ciphers for indexing, but these marks did not belong to any cataloguing system she knew. A story she'd once read in a medieval manuscripts course came to her mind. Rumors of the Knights Templar hiding messages in religious texts, using codes that blended astronomical signs and sacred geometry. The professor had dismissed it as romantic nonsense, but now, holding this fragile roll in her hands, Margaret felt the air in the room shift. She glanced toward the library's tall, arched windows. Outside, the late afternoon light was fading into amber. The rest of the staff had gone home hours ago. The only sounds were the creak of the building's ancient beams and the low hum of the heating vents. A flicker of doubt passed through her. Was she about to chase a medieval fairy tale, or was she holding something that could rewrite a chapter of history? She placed the parchment back into the hollow spine, closed the Bible, and locked it in the steel cabinet by her desk. Still, she could not stop glancing at it as she tidied up for the night. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Sir Edmund's life, she whispered, almost unconsciously, as though narrating her own strange evening. Margaret switched off the desk lamp, but as she stepped into the cold night air, she knew she would dream of symbols and secret codes until morning. Margaret arrived at the library early the next morning, the winter air still sharp in her lungs. The streets were empty except for the occasional delivery truck, and the heavy oak doors groaned as she unlocked them. She bypassed her usual ritual of tea and mail sorting, heading straight to the locked cabinet where the medieval Bible lay. The room was dim in the early light, the tall windows casting pale stripes across the floor. She pulled out the book with a mix of reverence and urgency, setting it on the desk beneath her strongest lamp. The leather was cool to the touch, and for a moment she hesitated, half expecting the events of the night before to feel like a dream, but the weight in her hands and the faint rattle in the spine told her otherwise. She opened the Bible to the first marked page, placing the hidden parchment beside her. Her eyes scanned the margins, tracing the faint brown marks. They weren't randomly placed. Each was burned or inked into the page with deliberate precision, often aligning with a specific word or letter. Margaret retrieved her notebook and began to sketch what she saw. Small crosses, intersecting lines, and strange shapes that reminded her of medieval alchemical symbols. She flipped through page after page, marking down each occurrence. It wasn't until she spread the sketches out across her desk that the pattern became clearer. The symbols weren't in isolation, they seemed to form a sequence, like coordinates or steps in a ritual. And then she saw it, a repetition every 7 pages, each cluster forming a loose arc when mapped together. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the magnifying glass again. Along the edges of some symbols, faint red pigment clung stubbornly to the vellum. This wasn't random ink, this was carefully planned, and old enough to predate even the printed book era. She was still puzzling over the meaning when a voice behind her broke the silence. Those aren't just symbols. That's a variation of the Templar cipher. Margaret spun around to see Dr. Adrian Leclerc standing in the doorway. The local historian had been researching medieval military orders for decades and was a frequent, if eccentric, visitor to the library. His greying beard and perpetually rumpled tweed coat made him look like a man who belonged in another century. "You startled me," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "What do you mean, a Templar cipher?" Leclerc stepped closer, his eyes narrowing on the parchment. "I've seen similar markings in a manuscript in Marseille. They used geometric overlays to conceal instructions, coordinates, names, sometimes entire maps. This variation, it's rarer, meant to be read only under certain light conditions." Margaret frowned. "How could you possibly know that from a glance?" He smiled thinly. "Because I once spent 5 years trying to crack one, and when I finally did, I found nothing." The map it revealed had been destroyed centuries ago, but this, he gestured to her table, this looks intact. Margaret felt a surge of curiosity, but also a creeping unease. If this is what you say it is, why hide it in a Bible? Leclerc's expression darkened. Because the Templars trusted the sanctity of Scripture. It was the one thing their enemies were least likely to burn. She returned her gaze to the symbols. The air between them felt heavier, as though the room itself was holding its breath. "So what do we do?" she asked. Leclerc leaned in, lowering his voice. "First, you don't tell anyone else. Second, you let me help you decipher it, but understand, If this is authentic, there are people who would kill to keep it buried. The words sank in slowly. Margaret wasn't a thrill-seeker. She had spent her life among dust and silence, not danger, and yet a quiet voice in her mind whispered that this was the kind of discovery that came once in a lifetime. She nodded slowly. "All right, we'll work together." Leclerc gave the faintest of nods, his eyes glinting in the lamplight. "Then we begin tonight." The library's reading room took on a different character at night. Gone were the chatter of students and the quiet shuffles of visitors. Instead, shadows pooled between the stacks, and the sound of the ticking wall clock seemed unnaturally loud. Margaret sat at the large oak table in the centre, the medieval Bible open under a bright desk lamp. Across from her, Dr. Adrien Leclerc leaned forward, his tweed coat folded neatly over the back of his chair, sleeves rolled up. They had agreed to work after hours to avoid curious eyes. Margaret had locked the doors herself, posting a "closed for cataloguing" sign at the entrance. The hush that followed was both comforting and ominous. Leclerc adjusted his glasses and began laying out tools, magnifying lenses, tracing paper, a small ultraviolet lamp. Margaret watched as he passed the beam over the Bible's pages, her breath catching when the faint brown markings flared into sharper focus under the purple light. "There," he murmured. "See how the pigment reflects differently? That's not ordinary ink. It's mixed with a metallic compound, likely to preserve visibility under certain lighting." Margaret leaned closer. "So, these are meant to be invisible to the naked eye, unless someone knew how to reveal them?" "Precisely," Leclerc said, "and the fact that you spotted them without the lamp tells me you have a very sharp eye." He began copying the symbols onto tracing paper, overlaying them in sequence as they moved through the Bible. Margaret worked alongside him, matching the parchment from the hollow spine to the symbols in the margins. Slowly, a connection began to emerge. The parchment wasn't just a list of symbols, it was a key. "It's like a chessboard," she whispered at one point. "Every symbol here corresponds to a letter, but only if placed on the right square." Leclerc nodded approvingly. The Templars loved double-layer ciphers, one to hide the language, another to hide the meaning. Hours passed in concentrated silence, interrupted only by the scratch of pens and the occasional exchange of ideas. By midnight, they had deciphered a partial message. "At the place where the sea eats the land, beneath the arch of the white cliff, the Brotherhood sleeps." Margaret sat back, rubbing her eyes. "That sounds like a location." Leclerc's expression had turned grave. "It does. And I know where. Northern coast of France, Étretat, white chalk cliffs, natural stone arches. I've walked there myself." Her stomach tightened. If this is right, then the Templars hid something there. Before Leclerc could answer, a faint creak echoed from the far end of the reading room. Margaret froze. The library was supposed to be empty. She exchanged a glance with Leclerc, who quietly set down his pen. Another sound followed, a soft scrape like leather on wood. Someone was moving among the stacks. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "I locked the doors." Leclerc rose silently, moving toward the sound. But before he reached the end of the aisle, a shadow flickered past the far window, and the faint metallic click of the exterior door latch echoed through the space. Whoever it was had already left. Margaret's pulse thudded in her ears. On the table, The Bible lay open, the tracing papers scattered like pieces of a puzzle. And on top of them, as if placed there deliberately, was a small scrap torn from an envelope. In neat, unfamiliar handwriting, it read, "Leave it alone." Leclerc picked it up, studying the paper. "Someone knows," he said grimly. Margaret swallowed, the weight of the warning pressing down on her. For the first time since finding the hollow spine, she felt the true danger of what they were doing. Yet, deep inside, she also felt something else. A flicker of defiance. Morning light spilled across Margaret's desk, but its warmth did nothing to ease the knot in her stomach. The note, "Leave it alone," sat in the top drawer, locked away with the Bible and the parchment. She had slept barely 3 hours. Her mind replaying the shadow in the library and the soft scrape of unseen footsteps. Leclerc arrived precisely at 9, his jaw tight, his eyes sharper than usual. He placed a folded map on the desk without a word. Margaret unfolded it to reveal a detailed chart of the Normandy coastline. "Etretat," he said, pointing to a section marked by jagged chalk-white lines. "The cliffs here have several natural arches. One in particular, the Arch of Aval, matches the description in the cipher. Where the sea eats the land. It's accessible only at low tide." Margaret traced the lines on the map with her fingertip. "And the Brotherhood sleeps?" Leclerc leaned closer. "A burial site, or a hidden chamber. The Templars were known to hide treasures and documents underground, especially after the order was dissolved. If they used the cliffs, the sea would serve as both a shield and a trap." The thought sent a shiver through her. She imagined narrow stone tunnels beneath the pounding surf, dark and airless. "If someone followed us in the library," she said slowly, "then they might already know where this leads." "Which is why," Leclerc replied, "we must move quickly." They spent the next 2 hours deciphering the remaining symbols. The code revealed not just a location, but instructions for reaching it, a tide schedule, a precise entry point marked by a carved cross, and a warning, written in Latin, that read, "Beware the falling waters, they guard what cannot be replaced." Margaret read it aloud. Falling waters. That could mean a tide surge or a trap, Leclerc finished. Templar engineering was inventive. By noon, they had made their decision. Leclerc would secure transport to France while Margaret arranged for temporary leave from the library. Neither spoke openly about the risks, but both knew the warning note was not idle. As Margaret packed the Bible and the parchment into a padded case, she felt a mix of dread and exhilaration. She had spent her career cataloguing history. Now she was about to walk into it. That night, as she locked up the library, she noticed something that made her stop cold. The brass handle of the front door was warm to the touch. She'd been alone inside for the last hour. The next morning, they boarded a small ferry from Portsmouth under the cover of heavy fog. Margaret stood at the railing, gripping the case to her chest as the white cliffs of England faded into the mist. Across the narrow channel somewhere beyond the horizon the Arch of Aval waited, and with it perhaps the last great secret of the Knights Templar. Leclerc joined her at the railing, his voice low. "Once we set foot there, we can't turn back easily. You're certain?" Margaret met his gaze. "We've come this far. Whatever's under those cliffs, CT, I need to see it with my own eyes." He nodded once, as if sealing a pact. "Then we go at the next low tide." The ferry cut through the waves, the sound of the engine merging with the hiss of the sea. In the distance, gulls wheeled and cried, as though heralding a journey that could end in glory or ruin. The library in Etretat smelled faintly of salt and old paper, a comforting blend that momentarily eased Margaret's tension. They had stopped there first, Leclerc insisting they review local archives before venturing to the cliffs. The Templars left more than physical clues, he explained. Sometimes the written record survives where the stone has crumbled. Margaret ran her fingers over a stack of bound parish records, while Leclerc pored over a weathered chart of the coast. The librarian on duty, a small, silver-haired woman, regarded them with polite curiosity, but asked no questions. It was just after midday when Margaret stepped into the narrow archive room to retrieve an atlas. The dim light made the rows of shelving look endless, the silence broken only by the muffled thump of waves against the shore outside. As she reached for a volume, she felt the hairs on her neck prickle. Someone had been at her desk. She hurried back into the main room. Her satchel, where she'd placed the padded case containing the Bible, was unzipped. Papers were neatly stacked on top. But the Bible was slightly askew inside, as if it had been lifted and replaced. Her pulse surged. "Leclerc!" she said sharply. He looked up, instantly alert. "Someone's been in my bag." His eyes flicked toward the silver-haired librarian at the front desk, but she was absorbed in her own work. He stood, scanning the room. "Nothing's missing?" Margaret shook her head. "Not that I can tell, but it feels deliberate." They finished their work quickly after that. Gathering what information they could, a 17th century account of fishermen who found an iron cross etched into the base of the Aval Arch, and spoke of voices like wind in the caverns beneath. Most dismissed it as superstition. Back at the small inn where they were staying, Margaret double-checked the Bible, relieved to find the parchment still inside. But when she opened her suitcase to retrieve fresh clothes, she found a slip of paper folded into the collar of her sweater. "Go home. Last warning." Her breath caught. The handwriting was identical to the note left in the library back in England. She carried it to Leclerc, who read it with narrowed eyes. "They followed us here." Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her, like the eye of a storm. "Then we're close." Leclerc studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Low tide is at dawn tomorrow. We'll need headlamps, rope, and a small boat to approach from the sea. The path overland is too exposed." The night passed in fitful snatches of sleep. Margaret dreamed of white cliffs crumbling into a black sea, of an iron cross glowing faintly in the surf, and of shadowy figures watching from the rocks. When the alarm rang at 4:30 a.m., she was already awake. They moved quickly, loading their gear into a rented skiff. The sea was calm, the horizon just beginning to pale with the first hint of day. As they pushed away from the dock, Margaret glanced back at the quiet town. A lone figure stood on the shore, hands in pockets, watching them until the fog swallowed his outline. The skiff's small engine hummed as they cut through the steel-grey water. The cliffs of Etretat loomed ahead, spectral in the mist, their chalk faces streaked with darker seams where centuries of rain had carved deep channels. The famous Arch of Aval rose like the ribcage of some ancient beast, its curve white against the shifting tide. Margaret sat in the bow, the Bible and parchment secured in a waterproof satchel strapped to her chest. She could feel the pulse of the sea beneath her feet, each swell lifting and dropping the boat as though it were a toy. The cold air stung her cheeks, and a faint roar grew louder as they neared the arch, the sound of waves colliding in the cavern beyond. Leclerc steered them into a narrow channel, scanning the cliff base. "We're looking for the cross," he called over the wind. They passed under the massive stone arch, the morning light filtering through like the glow of a cathedral window. Margaret's eyes swept the jagged walls. Then she saw it. A weather-worn iron cross, no larger than her forearm, bolted into the stone just above the high water line. "There!" she shouted, pointing. Leclerc throttled down, guiding the skiff close. The cross marked the entrance to a fissure, just wide enough for a person to slip through at low tide. Beyond, darkness swallowed the rock. They anchored the skiff to a jutting ledge and clambered onto the slick stones. The tide's retreat had exposed a narrow path leading into the cliff. Margaret switched on her headlamp, the beam cutting a silver tunnel through the black. Inside, the air was cold and damp, smelling faintly of salt and something older, stone dust perhaps, or decay. The walls closed in on either side, forcing them to move single file. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, each drop echoing in the confined space. After several minutes, the tunnel widened into a low chamber. Margaret's breath caught. Carved into the walls were more of the strange geometric symbols from the Bible, their lines worn but still visible. In the center of the chamber lay a stone slab, waist-high, with an indentation shaped like a cross. Leclerc's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. A reliquary. "This is where they kept something sacred." Margaret reached into her satchel and pulled out the parchment. The symbols along its edges matched those on the walls, but one sequence in the center was different. A simple pattern of 4 lines, intersecting in a way that looked eerily like the indentation on the slab. As she placed the parchment over the indentation, Leclerc ran his hands along the slab's edge, searching. His fingers found a recessed groove. He pressed, and with a grinding sound, the slab shifted. A hollow space yawned beneath. Inside lay a weathered wooden chest, its surface carved with a Templar cross. The metal fittings were rusted but intact. Leclerc hesitated, glancing at Margaret. "Are you ready?" Before she could answer, a noise echoed from the tunnel, the faint scuff of footsteps on wet stone. Margaret's headlamp beam jerked toward the sound, catching only the curve of the tunnel as it bent into darkness. The footsteps stopped. Leclerc's voice was low, tense. "We're not alone." Margaret's breath quickened, the damp air pressing against her lungs. The sound of footsteps had ceased, but the heavy silence that followed felt even more ominous. Leclerc straightened slowly, one hand resting on the chest, the other sliding toward the small utility knife he carried. The beam of Margaret's headlamp swept across the tunnel mouth. Nothing, just wet stone, glistening in the pale light. But she knew someone was there. She could feel it, the same way she'd felt eyes on her back in the library. "Help me," Leclerc whispered, gesturing toward the chest. "If they're coming, we take it with us now." Together they heaved it up. The wood was heavy, but the weight inside shifted with a faint, metallic clink, as though it held objects wrapped or bound together. The sound sent a thrill down Margaret's spine. Relics, coins, perhaps even scrolls. A faint splash echoed from the tunnel, then a voice, male, sharp with urgency. "Leave it!" Margaret froze. The voice was closer now, Bouncing off the chamber walls, she and Leclerc exchanged a glance. There was no way to retreat without passing whoever had spoken. Leclerc's jaw tightened. "There's another way," he murmured, scanning the chamber walls. His gaze landed on a narrow slit in the stone, partially concealed by a fallen chunk of rock. "Help me clear it." They shoved the debris aside, revealing a tight passage that sloped downward. The air that rushed out was colder, tinged with the briny tang of the sea. "It might lead to an outer opening," Leclerc said. Margaret nodded, clutching the chest's handle. Together they maneuvered into the narrow passage, the wood scraping against the walls. The tunnel bent sharply, and soon the sound of waves grew louder, mingling with the muffled shouts echoing from behind them. They emerged onto a small, wave-slick ledge at the cliff's base. The tide was lower now, revealing a narrow strip of rock leading around the arch. Their skiff bobbed in the distance, tethered to the ledge where they had first landed. "Go," Leclerc urged. Margaret moved as quickly as she dared, the chest awkward in her grip. The wind off the sea was sharp, flinging cold spray into her face. She didn't dare look back until they reached the skiff. Leclerc hauled the chest aboard while Margaret scrambled in after him. As he started the engine, a dark figure appeared at the mouth of the tunnel they had just left. The man stood still, his features obscured by shadow, but his voice carried clearly over the water. "This isn't yours to take." Leclerc gunned the engine, and the skiff surged forward. Margaret gripped the edge of the boat, her heart pounding as the cliffs receded. The figure did not follow, but his presence clung to her like the chill of the sea. Only when they were well beyond the arch did Leclerc speak again, his voice steady but low. "We open it tonight, away from prying eyes." Margaret nodded, though she couldn't shake the image of the man standing in the shadows, watching, waiting, as if their escape had only been the first move in a longer game. They didn't return to the inn. Leclerc steered the skiff south along the coast to a small fishing village where he had a friend who owed him a favor. By the time they tied up at a private dock, the sky was the deep cobalt of early evening. They carried the chest to a weathered boathouse, its wooden walls humming faintly in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of rope, salt, and engine oil. Leclerc bolted the door behind them and set the chest on a workbench. Margaret stood close, her damp coat dripping onto the worn planks, eyes fixed on the Templar cross carved into the lid. "Once we open this," Leclerc said quietly, "there's no undoing it. Whatever's inside, it may not be gold or relics. It could be dangerous knowledge." Margaret felt the weight of his words. If they hid it so well, it meant something to them. And someone clearly doesn't want us to see it. Leclerc's hands worked at the rusted fittings. The lock gave with a reluctant snap, and the lid creaked open. Inside, layers of oiled cloth wrapped a collection of objects. The first bundle contained several ornate silver chalices, their surfaces etched with Latin inscriptions. Beneath them, a leather tube sealed with wax. Leclerc broke the seal and slid out a rolled parchment. Margaret unrolled it slowly, her breath catching. The ink was faded but legible, a map of Europe marked with tiny red crosses and annotations in medieval French. But it wasn't the map itself that froze her. In one corner, in careful Latin script, was a declaration: "Custodite, veritatem usque ad tempus revelandi." Guard the truth until the time of revealing. Beneath the map lay another document, its handwriting more hurried, almost desperate. It described a network of Templar safe houses and a final mission to protect a specific relic whose existence could fracture the church and the crown alike. Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears. This was more than treasure, this was history, with the power to reshape Europe's past, and, perhaps, its present. Leclerc looked at her gravely. If this became public, it would trigger a storm. Politically, religiously, some would call it heresy, Margaret. Others would kill to possess it. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rattling the boathouse walls. Margaret thought of the man in the tunnel. The warnings slipped into her belongings, the weight of the Bible in her hands that first night. She imagined headlines, scholars arguing on television, politicians posturing over a relic none of them deserved to hold. And then she imagined the parchment sealed again, hidden where no greed could touch it. She met Leclerc's eyes. "We can't give it to them, not yet." He studied her, then nodded slowly. "Then we hide it somewhere safer than the Templars ever did." Weeks later, back in St. Bartholomew's, Margaret resumed her quiet routines. The medieval Bible had been returned to its locked cabinet, its spine empty now but still bearing the faint smell of smoke. Visitors came and went, unaware of the journey it had sparked. Sometimes, when the library was empty and the winter light slanted across her desk, Margaret would allow herself a moment to remember the sound of waves in the chamber, the cold weight of the chest, the map's whispered promises. She had not destroyed the contents. She and Leclerc had placed them in a vault known only to them, waiting for the day when the time of revealing would feel right. Until then, the truth slept again. This time in the care of a humble librarian who understood that some knowledge once freed could never be caged again. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.